Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage former U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished guests, and fellow Atlanticists, good evening. In the last few years, we seem to be observing the 70th anniversary of everything. And over the last few days, many of us have been commemorating George Marshall, who gave his famous speech at Harvard announcing a plan to save Europe on June 5th, 1947, 70 years ago today. The United States entered World War II because we had to, because our immediate survival was at stake. The same cannot be said about the Marshall Plan. In 1947, the American people were weary of war and wary of new commitments. They wanted nothing more than to come home, stay home, and make the baby boom boom. It was not self-evident that our nation would come together to support the act of enlightened self-interest, which was the Marshall Plan. But we did. And we did it in a way that was uniquely inclusive in design, uniquely expansive in scope, and uniquely American in spirit. We used Marshall aid to encourage the creation of a united Europe, which was an ambitious goal just a few years after the most terrible war in European history. We offered Marshall aid to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, though the Iron Curtain had already begun to descend. Our vision specifically embraced our former adversaries, even though this was hard for many people to accept. The Marshall Plan planted seeds of transatlantic partnership that would soon blossom in the form of NATO and the cooperative institutions of a new Europe. But just as important was the expression of leadership that the Marshall Plan conveyed. After World War I, America had withdrawn from the world, shunning responsibility and avoiding risk. Others did the same. The result was the rise of great evil in the heart of Europe. But after the devastation of World War II and the horror of the Holocaust, it was not enough to say that the enemy had been vanquished and that what we were against had failed. The generation of Marshall, Truman, and Vandenberg was determined to build a lasting peace. And the message that generation conveyed from the White House, from both parties on Capitol Hill, and from people across our country who donated millions in relief cash, clothing, and food was that this time America would not turn inward. America would lead. In my own life, I have seen the difference that this kind of American leadership made. And I'm speaking not as the former Secretary of State, but as a child of Czechoslovakia born before World War II. In the early years of my life, America was absent when the Munich Agreement sacrificed my country's sovereignty in the name of appeasement. America was likewise absent when the war broke out and my family fled to England. And I can still remember sitting in the bomb shelter, singing away the fear, but worrying that we might be left to fight the war alone. And then, one day, wonderful news came from across the sea. A brave military had answered the call, and it was on its way to rescue freedom. And soon enough, America and its allies engineered D-Day, VE Day, and the Marshall Plan. By then, we had returned to Czechoslovakia, and my father was working for the democratic government as a diplomat. But his boss, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, was told by Stalin in Moscow that his country cannot participate in the Marshall Plan, despite its national interest in doing so. Upon his return to Prague, Masaryk said it was at that moment he understood he was employed by a government no longer sovereign in its own land. It could only be a matter of months before the government was taken over by the communists. Masaryk was killed, and my family was once again forced into exile, this time sailing across the ocean to a new and welcoming home. I try to avoid seeing all of European history through the prism of Czechoslovakia, but it is true that after the 1948 coup, it did hasten the passage of the Marshall Plan in Congress and led to the creation of NATO. So these institutions have always been a part of the fabric of my life. Because of the vision of the Truman-Marshall generation, I was privileged to live my life in an era where America stood for freedom and opportunity across the world. It may be hard for people today who have no memory of that time 70 years ago to understand the difference that American leadership made, but it is necessary for them to try to understand, because today, here in America, we are facing a great danger, and that danger is not a foreign enemy. It is the possibility that we will fail to hear the example of Marshall, that we will take for granted the institutions and principles upon which our own freedom is based, and forget what the history of the past century reminds us. Problems abroad, if left unattended, will come home to America, and the United States is stronger when it has allies and friends that share our interests and our ideals. For nearly 70 years, one institution has stood above all others,